The loudest moment in women's basketball this year didn't come from a buzzer beater, a record-breaking night, or even a championship celebration. It came from silence. When the official roster for the United States women's Olympic basketball team dropped, fans didn't immediately celebrate the names that made it. They searched for the one name that didn't. And once they realized who was missing, everything changed. This was supposed to be the moment women's basketball finally stepped fully into the mainstream. Ticket sales were exploding. Viewership was surging. Arenas that once echoed were suddenly sold out weeks in advance. For the first time in decades, the sport didn't feel like it was asking for attention. It had taken it. And at the center of that shift was one player. A rookie. A sharpshooter. A cultural lightning rod. Caitlin Clark. She wasn't just playing basketball. She was driving conversations. She was dominating headlines that usually ignored the WNBA entirely. She was pulling casual fans into a league they had never watched before. And yet, when the biggest stage in global sports opened its doors, she was left standing outside. The explanation came quickly. Experience. Seniority. Chemistry. All the familiar buzzwords that sound reasonable on paper. But almost immediately, those words started to fall apart. Because this wasn't a borderline player. This wasn't a developmental prospect. This was the most talked about athlete in the sport, producing at a level that veterans couldn't ignore, and carrying an audience the league had spent decades trying to build. That's when the tone shifted. Fans stopped asking whether Caitlin Clark deserved a spot and started asking why she was being kept out. Why, in a year where visibility mattered more than ever, the face of the movement was excluded. Why a league desperate for growth would choose comfort over momentum. And why the decision felt less like evaluation and more like a warning. The silence from leadership only made it louder. No clear justification. No transparent breakdown. Just a firm decision and an expectation that everyone would accept it and move on. But they didn't. Because this wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about power. About who gets to decide the future of the sport. About whether popularity is embraced or punished. And about what happens when a system built on hierarchy feels threatened by something it can't control. That's where Stephen A. Smith enters the picture. Not as a hype machine. Not as a provocateur. But as someone willing to say out loud what many inside the sport were only whispering privately. He didn't frame the situation as a tough call or a close debate. He framed it as a push. A deliberate move. A decision driven by ego, insecurity, and fear of being overshadowed. Because when you strip away the talking points, one uncomfortable question remains. How does the most impactful player in the sport's biggest moment suddenly become unnecessary? And what does that say about the people making the decisions? This story isn't about a roster spot. It's about a power struggle happening in real time. A clash between an old guard that spent years grinding for relevance and a new wave that arrived with instant attention, money, and influence. It's about what happens when growth doesn't ask for permission. And it's about how one decision exposed the cracks in a system that wasn't ready for change. And once you start looking closely, the official story doesn't just weaken. It collapses. The official justification sounded clean and professional. Caitlin Clark wasn't left off the Olympic roster because of politics or fear or ego. She was left off because of basketball. Or at least, that's what they wanted people to believe. Experience mattered. International play was different. Defense was more physical. Chemistry took time. Paying dues was part of the process. On the surface, those arguments felt safe. Familiar. Almost impossible to challenge without sounding emotional. But the problem wasn't how the explanation sounded. The problem was that none of it matched reality. At the time the decision was made, Caitlin Clark wasn't struggling to adjust to the professional game. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't fading against better competition. She was thriving. As a rookie, she was leading the league in assists. Not among rookies. Among everyone. She was near the top in scoring while being the primary focus of every opposing defense. Teams weren't guarding her with respect. They were designing entire game plans around stopping her and still failing. Rookies aren't supposed to control the tempo of games. They aren't supposed to dictate defensive rotations. They aren't supposed to make veterans look reactive instead of proactive. And yet that's exactly what was happening night after night. Clark wasn't just producing. She was organizing offenses, stretching the floor, forcing adjustments, and making teammates better in ways that don't always show up in a box score. That's where the experience argument starts to crack. Because Team USA wasn't building a fragile roster that needed perfect balance just to survive. This was a team that historically wins Olympic Games by double digits, sometimes by 30 or 40 points. A team so deep that even limited minutes from a rookie wouldn't affect the outcome. The idea that Caitlin Clark couldn't contribute in some capacity, whether as a scorer, a facilitator, or simply a strategic weapon, was difficult to take seriously. Stephen A. Smith didn't dance around that contradiction. He went straight at it. He pointed out that even if Clark never stepped on the floor, her presence alone would have added value. Value in preparation. Value in spacing. Value in forcing opponents to think differently. And most importantly, value in visibility. The notion that she somehow wasn't good enough to sit on the bench of the most dominant team in women's basketball history sounded less like analysis and more like avoidance. The defensive criticism followed the same pattern. Yes, Clark was adjusting to the physicality of the pro game. So was every rookie before her. But the idea that defense suddenly became a disqualifier rang hollow when players with clear limitations on that end were still included. Defense mattered, until it didn't. Physicality mattered, until it didn't. Consistency was never the point. Control was. Then came the chemistry argument. This one was repeated often, mostly because it was vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Chemistry can't be measured. It can't be disproven. It exists wherever decision-makers say it does. But Smith dismantled that reasoning almost instantly. Great players adapt. Elite players elevate. Basketball IQ travels. Passing instincts don't disappear at customs. The suggestion that one of the smartest offensive players in the game couldn't function alongside elite teammates wasn't just weak. It was insulting. Chemistry has never stopped greatness before. It didn't stop superstars from sharing the floor on previous Olympic teams. It didn't stop dominant personalities from coexisting when winning was the priority. And it certainly didn't stop players with far less versatility from making the roster. The difference was never fit. The difference was who the system was built to protect. As more people examined the numbers, the gap between explanation and evidence grew impossible to ignore. Clark wasn't surviving on volume alone. She was efficient under pressure. She was making reads at speed. She was generating open looks for teammates who had never seen that kind of defensive attention before. If the Olympic roster was truly about putting the best tools on the floor, leaving her off required an explanation stronger than tradition. That's when fans began to realize something uncomfortable. The basketball reasoning wasn't designed to convince skeptics. It was designed to end the conversation. To sound official enough that questioning it felt disrespectful. But once someone like Stephen A. Smith challenged it publicly, the spell broke. The talking points couldn't survive contact with the facts. Because when a rookie is already shaping the league style of play, when her impact is measurable and undeniable, and when her presence changes how teams, media, and fans engage with the sport, calling her unready stops sounding analytical. It starts sounding defensive. And that's when the conversation shifted from whether the decision made sense on the court to why it made sense off of it. Once the basketball explanation collapsed, attention turned to the part no professional league likes to admit out loud. Sports are competition, but they are also business. Revenue, exposure, branding, growth. Every major decision, especially one involving the Olympics, is supposed to balance winning with visibility. And that's where the Caitlin Clark snub became impossible to defend. The Olympics aren't just about medals. They are a global commercial. A multi-week showcase designed to introduce athletes and leagues to audiences that may never seek them out on their own. Every federation understands this. The NBA understood it in 1992. That's why the Dream Team wasn't just stacked with talent. It was stacked with icons. The goal wasn't merely dominance. It was expansion. Caitlin Clark represented that exact opportunity for women's basketball. At the moment the roster was announced, she wasn't just the most recognizable name in the WNBA. She was more recognizable than the league itself. Her games were outperforming national broadcasts. Her highlights were circulating beyond sports media and into mainstream culture. She had become a gateway. People weren't tuning in because they loved women's basketball. They were tuning in because they loved watching her. Stephen A. Smith framed it bluntly. You don't hide your biggest asset during the most visible event in the world. You don't leave attention on the table. You don't turn down free marketing. Especially not when your league has spent decades fighting for relevance. The logic simply didn't add up. If the goal was to grow the game, leaving Clark at home was the opposite of strategy. The financial implications were obvious. Ratings drive sponsorships. Sponsorships drive investment. Investment drives infrastructure. Clark wasn't just moving ticket sales in Indiana. She was shifting national interest. Networks knew it. Advertisers knew it. Even casual fans knew it. And yet, the decision-makers chose to prioritize internal comfort over external growth. That choice revealed something important. Growth wasn't the priority. Stability was. Control was. The league was comfortable growing slowly, predictably, on its own terms. Clark disrupted that timeline. She accelerated it. And acceleration makes institutions nervous. Because rapid growth brings change, and change threatens existing hierarchies. Smith compared the situation to owning a luxury car and choosing not to drive it. The asset was there. The moment was there. The audience was waiting. And still, the league opted for familiarity. Veterans over visibility. Structure over spectacle. It wasn't cautious. It was fearful. Even from a purely competitive standpoint, the decision was baffling. Team USA wasn't entering a rebuilding phase. They weren't vulnerable. They were overwhelming favorites. There was no real downside to bringing Clark along. No risk to the gold medal. The only risk was to egos. To attention distribution. To who the cameras would follow. And that's where the business logic exposed the emotional truth. This wasn't about maximizing reach. It was about managing it. About controlling where attention flowed and who benefited from it. Clark's presence would have shifted the narrative away from established stars and toward a future they didn't fully own yet. Stephen A. Smith didn't accuse the league of incompetence. He accused it of self-sabotage. Of choosing short-term comfort over long-term gain. Of misunderstanding what moments like this are for. The Olympics come once every 4 years. Momentum like Clark's doesn't wait. The league had a chance to introduce its next era to the world on the biggest stage imaginable. Instead, it chose to protect the current one. And when organizations do that, it's rarely because they don't see the opportunity. It's because they see it too clearly. Because if money wasn't the problem, and basketball wasn't the problem, then the problem had to be personal. Long before the Olympic roster was announced, the tension was already there. It just hadn't been labeled yet. At first, it came across as commentary. Veteran insight. Tough love. The kind of things older players say about rookies all the time. Warnings about physicality. Reminders that the professional game humbles everyone. On the surface, it sounded normal. Even reasonable. But context changes everything. As Caitlin Clark's popularity exploded, so did the tone around her. What once sounded like mentorship began to feel like resistance. Subtle dismissals. Side comments. A constant emphasis on what she wasn't instead of what she was. The more attention she received, the more the conversation shifted from performance to personality. From skill to handling the moment. One of the clearest examples came from Diana Taurasi. A legend. A face of the league. When she publicly warned that reality was coming for Clark, it was framed as advice. But looking back, it carried a different weight. It wasn't about preparing a rookie. It was about setting expectations for how much shine she was allowed to have. It was a reminder that popularity didn't equal permission. When leaders speak, the rest of the room listens. Those comments didn't exist in isolation. They set a tone. They signaled that skepticism was acceptable. That pushing back against the hype was not only allowed, but encouraged. And once that door opens, resentment doesn't stay quiet for long. For players who had spent years grinding in relative obscurity, Clark's arrival was jarring. She didn't just walk into the league. She arrived with endorsement deals, sold-out crowds, national broadcasts, and constant media attention. Things many veterans had been told for years were unrealistic goals. Suddenly, the attention they had fought for appeared to be handed to someone else overnight. Stephen A. Smith acknowledged the humanity in that reaction. Envy is human. Frustration is human. But professionalism requires separating personal feelings from the bigger picture. That separation never fully happened. Instead, discomfort started disguising itself as critique. And critique slowly turned into opposition. The narrative became less about what Clark was doing on the court and more about whether she deserved the spotlight. Whether she had earned the attention. Whether she was being elevated too quickly. These questions weren't being asked about her numbers. They were being asked about her presence. This is where the Mean Girls dynamic enters the conversation. Not as a cheap insult, but as a description of social behavior. When someone enters a closed circle and instantly draws attention, the circle doesn't always expand. Sometimes it tightens. Sometimes it pushes back. Not openly. Quietly. Through exclusion. Through tone. Through who gets welcomed and who gets tolerated. Clark became the center of that tension. Not because she asked for it, but because attention followed her regardless. Every interview. Every camera angle. Every sold-out arena reinforced the imbalance. And instead of uniting the league, that imbalance exposed insecurities that had been simmering for years. By the time Olympic discussions began, the lines were already drawn. This wasn't a neutral evaluation process anymore. It was layered with history, with resentment, with an unspoken desire to slow things down. To remind the newcomer that access to the inner circle wasn't automatic. The decision didn't come from nowhere. Came from months of build-up. From a growing sense that Clark represented something uncontrollable. Something that shifted power away from the established order. And when institutions feel their grip loosening, they don't usually announce it. They act. The Olympic roster wasn't just a selection. It was a statement. If the tension had stayed verbal, it might have been dismissed as normal competitive friction. But it didn't. It showed up in the one place where intent is hardest to hide. On the court. And once it did, the conversation changed. Caitlin Clark didn't just face tough defense. Every star does. What she faced was something else. A pattern. Extra contact. Late bumps. Plays that had nothing to do with stopping a shot or contesting a pass. They were messages. And everyone watching understood them. One moment stood out more than the rest. A hip check on an inbound play that sent Clark to the floor. No play on the ball. No basketball purpose. Just a clear statement. This wasn't about defense. It was about letting her know she wasn't welcome to move freely. And the reaction afterward made it even louder. Smiles. Celebration. Indifference from officials. That moment didn't exist in isolation. It fit a larger pattern. Clark being grabbed off ball. Blitzed aggressively the second she crossed half court. Hit on drives without consistent whistles. Scratched, shoved, and knocked off balance in ways that were quietly tolerated. The physicality wasn't random. It was selective. Stephen A. Smith framed it as targeting. Not competition. Targeting. There's a difference between guarding someone hard and trying to wear them down. The goal wasn't just to make shots difficult. It was to make nights exhausting. To make every game a grind. To test not just her skill, but her patience. What made it worse was the lack of protection. Officials allowed the tone to be set early and rarely corrected it. That silence communicated approval. When rules are enforced selectively, players notice. They adjust. And some take advantage. The message was simple. You're going to earn everything the hard way. Not because that's how basketball works, but because that's how initiation works. Clark wasn't being treated like a rising star. She was being treated like an intruder. This is where the Olympic snub begins to feel less like an isolated decision and more like the final chapter of a campaign. The on-court treatment and the off-court exclusion mirrored each other. Both sent the same signal. We can't stop you from playing, but we can make sure you don't get comfortable. The veterans had influence. They always do. And when those veterans also have relationships with coaches, selectors, and decision-makers, lines blur. It stops being just about performance. It becomes about maintaining order. About reminding newcomers that acceptance isn't guaranteed by numbers alone. Stephen A. Smith pointed out that this kind of treatment wears on players differently. It's not just physical. It's mental. Knowing you're going to get hit harder. Knowing the whistle might not come. Knowing every mistake will be magnified. Over time, that pressure builds. By the time the Olympic roster was announced, Clark had already been carrying more than her share. She wasn't just adjusting to the league. She was navigating hostility disguised as toughness. And when the highest authority in the sport decided she wasn't needed on the biggest stage, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like confirmation. The message had been delivered. And it wasn't subtle. Once the emotional and physical patterns became clear, attention shifted to the structure behind them. Because moments like this don't happen in a vacuum. They happen inside systems. And when you look closely at how USA basketball is built, the decision starts to look less mysterious and more familiar. Power in women's basketball has long flowed through a small, interconnected network. Coaches become executives. Executives sit on committees. Committees select coaches. The same programs, the same pipelines, the same philosophies circulate year after year. This isn't unique to the WNBA. But it becomes a problem when access to opportunity depends more on relationships than results. Stephen A. Smith didn't call it corruption. He called it a club. And clubs operate on trust, loyalty, and comfort. Outsiders don't get the benefit of the doubt. They get monitored. They get evaluated more harshly. They're expected to prove themselves repeatedly while insiders move freely. Caitlin Clark came from outside that circle. Different program. Different style. Different audience. She didn't grow up in the system that feeds Team USA. She disrupted it. And disruption makes people defensive, especially when it comes from someone who doesn't need permission to be influential. The chemistry argument fits perfectly into this framework. Chemistry often becomes code for familiarity, for knowing how things are done, for not changing the rhythm of a room that's been operating the same way for years. Clark didn't just bring talent. She brought attention. And attention changes dynamics. Imagine the scene in Paris. Media swarms. Cameras hunting for reactions. Every press conference filled with questions about the rookie. Every highlight package leading with her logo threes. Every international broadcast framing her as the future. That spotlight wouldn't have been shared equally. And that reality made people uncomfortable. Reports began to surface that some veterans didn't want to deal with the distraction. They wanted the focus to remain on the team, on the system, on the players who had already paid their dues. On paper, that sounds noble. In practice, it's self-preservation. Stephen A. Smith framed it as ego. Not malicious. Human. But still damaging. When personal comfort becomes a deciding factor, merit loses its meaning. And when the people making the selections are tied socially and professionally to the players being protected, objectivity disappears. There were also questions about pedigree. Players with weaker numbers but stronger institutional ties made the roster. Players who fit the expected mold. Who wouldn't alter the hierarchy. Clark's absence wasn't just about who she was. It was about what she represented. A future that arrived faster than expected. Inside organizations, moments like this are often justified quietly. This isn't her time. She'll get her chance later. Let the veterans have their moment. But that logic assumes time is neutral. It isn't. Momentum fades. Opportunities don't wait. By keeping Clark out, the club preserved its balance. No internal disruption. No awkward shifts in attention. No renegotiation of status. But that balance came at a cost. Because while the insiders stayed comfortable, the outside world noticed. And once fans start seeing patterns, trust erodes. The Olympic roster stopped feeling like a celebration and started feeling like an inside job. Not because people wanted drama, but because the explanation no longer matched the optics. The club had protected itself. But in doing so, it revealed itself. The assumption behind the snub was simple. Leave Caitlin Clark off the biggest stage, and the noise would die down. The moment would pass. The system would reset. She would return to the league humbled, quieter, more manageable. That's usually how these things work. Except this time, it didn't. What actually happened was the opposite. For the first time in years, Clark stopped running. The constant cycle of games, travel, media, expectations, and pressure finally broke. While the Olympic team prepared for Paris, she was forced into something she hadn't been allowed since her final college run. Rest. That detail matters more than it seems. From the NCAA tournament to the draft to the immediate start of the WNBA season, Clark had been in motion without pause. Every game carried weight. Every appearance carried expectations. She wasn't just playing. She was carrying a narrative. That kind of load doesn't just drain the body. It drains decision-making, patience, precision. Stephen A. Smith described the toll clearly. Fighting on two fronts wears anyone down. On the court, defenders were targeting her physically. Off the court, institutions were questioning her legitimacy. There was no place to exhale. The Olympic decision was a rejection, yes. But it also created space. And space is dangerous when given to someone that talented. During the break, Clark wasn't answering questions. She wasn't absorbing contact. She wasn't adjusting to whistles or defending her presence. She was recovering. Mentally and physically. Bruises healed. Legs got fresh. The noise faded. When she returned, the difference was immediate. The hesitation was gone. The fatigue was gone. Her reads were sharper. Her pace was controlled. She wasn't forcing moments anymore. She was dictating them. The numbers followed. Assists piled up. Scoring efficiency climbed. Records started falling. Not in bursts, but consistently. She broke rookie marks that had stood untouched. She pushed her team into playoff contention when that had barely been a conversation before. The same league that tried to slow her down now had to deal with a more composed, more dangerous version of her. Stephen A. Smith went back on air and said what many were thinking. They didn't humble her. They recharged her. They gave her the one thing she couldn't buy: time. Meanwhile, the veterans returned from Paris exhausted. Travel. Tight rotations. International pressure. The wear showed. And the contrast became impossible to ignore. The player left behind was fresher than the ones who went. The narrative flipped. What was supposed to be a lesson became fuel. What was meant to preserve balance created imbalance. The push turned into a slingshot. This wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a miscalculation. The league underestimated how Clark would respond when removed from the spotlight. They assumed exclusion would diminish her. Instead, it refined her. And once that happened, the conversation moved beyond feelings. Because the data started confirming what the eye test already knew. The decision hadn't slowed the future. It had accelerated it. Emotion can be debated. Intent can be questioned. But numbers have a way of cutting through excuses. And once the viewership data started circulating, the Olympic decision stopped being controversial and started being indefensible. The women's Olympic basketball games performed well. Solid ratings. Respectable numbers. Exactly what Team USA had come to expect. But that was the problem. They weren't exceptional. They weren't explosive. They didn't capture the surge of attention that had defined the season. Meanwhile, regular season Indiana Fever games were doing something unheard of. Random weeknight broadcasts were outperforming national windows. Arenas were selling out in markets that had struggled for years. Highlights were circulating beyond sports fans and into general pop culture feeds. And all of it centered around one player who wasn't in Paris. Stephen A. Smith didn't sugarcoat it. The gold medal game, the pinnacle of the sport, drew fewer eyeballs than some of Clark's regular season appearances. That reality stung. Not because the Olympic team failed, but because it exposed how much potential had been left untouched. Broadcasters noticed. Executives noticed. Sponsors noticed. Billions are spent on Olympic rights with the expectation that stars will drive engagement. Clark was the star of the moment. And she wasn't there. The missed opportunity wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. The fallout extended beyond ratings. Fans felt dismissed. New viewers who had entered the sport through Clark felt like they were being told their interest didn't matter. That the player who drew them in wasn't valued by the institution itself. And instead of creating unity around Team USA, the decision fractured the audience. Two sides emerged. Purists defending tradition and hierarchy. New fans defending impact and momentum. The conversation became adversarial. Social media turned hostile. The league wasn't just losing an opportunity. It was managing a divide. Stephen A. Smith placed responsibility squarely on leadership. When institutions underestimate emotional investment, they lose trust. This wasn't about casual viewers flipping channels. This was about people feeling rejected by the sport they had just started supporting. The chemistry argument resurfaced here too, but it rang hollow. Great players figure it out. They always have. Basketball history is full of examples. Talent adapts. Intelligence adjusts. Clark's style wasn't incompatible with international play. It was ahead of it. By excluding her, Team USA didn't just reject a player. It rejected evolution. It chose comfort over progress. Safety over spectacle. And while that might preserve internal balance temporarily, it weakens the product long-term. The numbers made that clear. Growth stalled where it could have exploded. Momentum slowed where it could have surged. And all because the league misjudged how much the audience had already decided. Caitlin Clark wasn't the future waiting in line. She was the present being ignored. When the dust settled, the Olympic snub stopped being a single moment and started looking like a turning point. Not just for Caitlin Clark, but for the entire direction of women's basketball. Team USA won the gold medal, as expected. The system worked. On paper, nothing went wrong. But history doesn't remember paper. It remembers moments. And this one left a mark. Stephen A. Smith said it best when he framed the situation not as a basketball decision, but as a power play. Power plays are designed to remind people who's in charge. They're meant to reinforce hierarchy, protect status, and slow down change. But power plays only work when the audience agrees with them. This one didn't. Instead of humbling Caitlin Clark, the snub elevated her. It turned her into a symbol, not just of talent, but of resistance. She became the face of a new era colliding with an old structure that wasn't ready to loosen its grip. The exclusion validated what her supporters already believed. That she wasn't just fighting defenders. She was pushing against an institution uncomfortable with how fast she changed the game. The veterans protected their moment, but in doing so, they created an asterisk that won't fade easily. This Olympic team will always be remembered as the one that didn't bring the most influential player of its time. The one that chose familiarity over fearlessness. Safety over growth. Control over momentum. And Caitlin Clark walked away with something more valuable than a medal. She gained clarity. She gained rest. She gained motivation. The rejection sharpened her focus and strengthened her connection with fans who saw the decision for what it was. Not an evaluation. A message. Institutions often believe they can shape narratives by managing access. But when the public has already chosen, resistance doesn't erase influence. It amplifies it. The WNBA had its Tiger Woods moment. Its Jordan moment. Its Serena moment. And instead of putting that moment on the world stage, it hesitated. Stephen A. Smith wasn't stirring controversy. He was documenting reality. Confirming what millions of people felt instinctively. That this wasn't about readiness. It was about readiness for change. And the league wasn't ready. Caitlin Clark didn't force her way into the spotlight. The spotlight followed her. And when the doors closed, it didn't disappear. It just waited. Because the future doesn't ask for permission. It shows up. And the only question left is whether institutions choose to embrace it, or get dragged forward by it anyway. If you made it this far, you're not here by accident. You care about where this sport is going, and you're paying attention to the details most people ignore. This channel breaks down the stories behind the headlines, the power dynamics behind the decisions, and the moments that quietly change the direction of the game. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Like the video if this breakdown added value, because that tells the algorithm this conversation matters. And leave a comment sharing your take. Was this a basketball decision, or something much bigger? The discussion doesn't end here.